week 17 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few DST defense units I would start this week. The first one, the New England Patriots. So the Patriots here have an amazing matchup this week versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. They can't score the football, turn over the football at an alarming rate, and they give up the most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the last few weeks here, the numbers have definitely dropped for New England. From week 7 to week 12, they were one of the best defenses in fantasy football. Week 13 at Buffalo, 10 points allowed, 2 sacks, a fumble recovery. Week 15 at Indy, 27 points allowed, a sack and an into. And week 16 versus Buffalo, once again, 33 points allowed. So right here, I think the tide's going to turn this week. I know New England's still owned in a crazy amount of fantasy leagues at 91%. But if you have them on your roster, they're a must-start defense this week. And I think they finish off the week with the number one performance out of all defenses. The second defense I like this week as it starts, the San Francisco 49ers. So the 49ers, their defense has been hit or miss depending the matchup this season. But right here, they got a hit type of matchup versus the Houston Texans. I give up the 7th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the last few weeks here for San Francisco, week 14 at Cincinnati, 23 points allowed, 5 sacks, 2 fumble recoveries. Week 15 versus Atlanta, 13 points allowed, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. And week 16 at Tennessee, that didn't do much, 20 points allowed and 4 sacks. But what a great matchup versus Davis Mills in Houston, even though I know last week they put up 41 points versus the Chargers. I think that was a fluke. This week here, they got to travel to San Francisco. And I think San Francisco puts some hits on Mills in this one, gets a few turnovers, and possibly could find the end zone as well. The next defense is the New Orleans Saints. So the Saints here, they've been a hit-or-miss matchup-based defense as well this season. And they got a great matchup versus the Panthers, week 17. That gives up the second most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the Saints over the last few weeks, they've been pretty decent though. Week 14 at the Jets, 9 points allowed, 3 sacks. Week 15 at Tampa Bay, I know Mike Evans, Godwin, and Fournette went down in that ball game, but they still pitched a shutout, was this defense. 4 sacks, an interception, and a fumble recovery. And then on Monday Night Football, they were just put in a tough position with the rookie quarterback, Book, who put this defense in bad position the whole game. 14 points allowed, 3 sacks, and an into versus the Miami Dolphins. But this week here, Carolina has had trouble the majority of the season. They got a problem at quarterback where they're mixing and matching guys in and out of the ball game between Sam Darnold and Cam Newton last week. So right here, Newton's not a good quarterback, and Sam Darnold is not a good quarterback in my opinion. So I think this Saint defense in a ball game that they need to win this week, week 17, comes out and puts up a good performance, especially versus this weak Carolina offense that really don't have any weapons besides DJ Moore. The next defense I would start is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So the Bucs here, I think they're going to have a field day versus the New York Jets and Zach Wilson. I know the Jets look good, but it was the Jacksonville Jaguars, which means nothing in my opinion pretty much. So right here, I think Wilson's going to be running for his life in this ball game, and the Jets give up the 6th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And right here, Tampa Bay, I know they've had some injuries, but they're still going out there and making some plays. Week 14 versus Buffalo, 27 points allowed in that one, 3 sacks and interception. Week 15 versus New Orleans, 9 points allowed, 2 sacks. And week 16 at Carolina, 6 points allowed, 7 sacks in that one, and an into. So I think they can make Zach Wilson in this ball game look like a crash test dummy. 3 or 4 sacks, a few turnovers, and a great defensive performance. And the 5th and final defense I have as a start this week is the Seattle Seahawks. So surprisingly, the Seahawks, over the last month of the season, they've been fantasy relevant and usable for fantasy owners. And this week here, an amazing matchup versus the Lions. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the last few games here for Seattle, week 14 at Houston, 13 points allowed, 2 sacks. Week 15 at the Rams, 20 points allowed, 4 sacks and into. And week 16 versus Chicago, 25 points allowed and 4 sacks. So if it's either Boyle or Goff, depending who's going to start this ball game for the Detroit Lion offense, in my opinion, it don't really matter. If the Seahawks are at home, they got the 12th man. I know it hasn't been a great season this year at 6-9, but I still think they'll make a few plays. And this Lion offense, besides St. Brown, and if Swift comes back in this game, they don't really have many weapons or many options or playmakers. So I think the Seattle defense, once again, could have an 8 or 9 point fantasy day. So that's a few defenses I would start here in week 17 of the fantasy football season.